Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Wilson. I'm with the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, and welcome to today's event on the legacy of the Strategic Defense Initiative for Space Security. You know, one of the really fun things about being part of an organization like the Center for Space Policy and Strategy is to convene events on really interesting topics with really great, smart people who you like. And today's event is a perfect example of that. We have three speakers. Our first speaker is Caolionn O'Connell. Caolionn is a principal director here at the Aerospace Corporation, and she's someone who is well respected throughout the organization. I've gotten to work with Caolionn over the past year, and I've been immensely impressed with her work, as well as the work of the team she leads. Next, Anthony Eames is the Director of Scholarly Initiatives at the Ronald Reagan Foundation, and he's also a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I have known Anthony for over a decade. In fact, the first public panel that I was ever on was with Anthony back in 2014. And it's been great to see all of Anthony's successes over the years and to partner with his organization for today's event. Last is Aaron Bateman, an assistant professor at George Washington University. Aaron is a close friend, and he's also someone who not only has an impressive command of current national security space topics, but he's able to look at them from a historical lens. And by doing that, he's able to draw insights that no one else quite can, or at least as compellingly as he can. And it's for that reason that, for me, Aaron is one of those few people who everything he writes, I consider a must read. And his recently published terrific book on the Strategic Defense Initiative is no exception to that. So with that, welcome again to today's event, and I will now introduce Caolionn to the stage.
I am pleased to be providing the introductory remarks for this fireside chat featuring Anthony and Aaron. Given the highly secretive nature of space programs, it can be difficult to have a rich and nuanced discussion about space policy in an unclassified forum. But surprisingly, the conditions under which the Strategic Defense Initiative became a formal program bears remarkable similarities to our current circumstances, despite the passage of 40 years. Reflecting on the successes and challenges of SDI and how those lessons learned might apply to today provides the space community an opportunity to discuss current conditions without fear of jail time. So let's first discuss the circumstances that precipitated SDI and its similarities today. And here I will rely heavily on Aaron's book because, well, I always fear jail time, so SDI was notable for its radical reconsideration of the size and scope of the U.S. national security space enterprise, moving away from a few sophisticated satellites to a massive number of space systems on orbit, which is not dissimilar to the current proposed architecture for the missile warning, tracking, and defense layer. Today, the Space Force is moving away from a handful of exquisite systems to a multi-orbit proliferated architecture. One of the drivers for that change is the accepted understanding that space is no longer a safe haven. Looking back 40 years ago, there were also threats. They include everything from nuclear anti-satellite systems, page 13, fractional orbital bombardment systems, also known as FOBs, page 16, kinetic kill vehicles, page 51, and of course, high-energy laser weapon systems, page 161. To meet this changing landscape, SDI needed to create a system of systems, Observers recognize that integrating all of the components, even for just a phase one system, would constitute the largest and most complex undertaking of its kind. The necessity of creating a systems of systems to counteract and withstand the dynamic space environment remains true today, as indicated by the stand-up of the Space Systems Integration Office in 2021 and its recent elevation to report directly to Honorable Frank Covelli, the Senior Procurement Executive for Space Programs at the Department of the Air Force. But SDI suffered from being unable to communicate its role as part of a broader strategy. There was much talk about needing to deter the Soviets in space, but little coherent thinking about what a comprehensive military strategy involving space capabilities might look like. This is an important lesson we should consider taking forward today. We not only need to integrate our systems within the space domain, but that integration must extend to integrating with other domains as part of a larger theory of victory. While classification restrictions might impede that conversation, the Space Force will likely need to communicate its contributions to a terrestrial fight if it wishes to see continued investment in space capabilities supported by American taxpayers. And finally, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the role of politics. As part of a federally funded research and development center, we eschew politics and would much rather tackle the technological hurdles of any strategy. But it was noted throughout SDI's existence that the specific technologies chosen would have significant political implications. These implications included START treaties, diplomatic relations, and naturally domestic politics. While I will leave it to others to consider how SDI politics might have similar lessons learned for today, it would be hopelessly naive to think that it doesn't. And I will conclude with a quote from Vice President Dan Quayle that Aaron included in his book and is fitting for this fireside chat about space. Nowhere else are our scientific, technical, commercial, defense, and foreign policy goals more closely intertwined. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Aerospace Corporation, for having us here today on this event. It's always great fun to share a stage with Aaron. We've shared several stages together over the years, and it always seems to revolve around this thing, SDI, space security, and Aaron's tremendous new book on the topic, which I highly recommend you all go out and get. Aaron, in conversation about SDI over the years, one of the things we always seem to settle in over drinks, over dinner, are the misconceptions about SDI, which still are all over, both in the defense community and kind of in the broader discourse about space. Can you clear up some of those big misconceptions that you see in your book?
Well, firstly, I want to also thank the Aerospace Corporation for having both of us here today. So there's a number of SDI myths that I like to bust, but I'll just focus on a couple right now. I think one is that SDI was a bolt out of the blue, that it came out of nowhere in the 1980s. And in reality, there was a much bigger and slower transformation in the way that the United States was using space technologies for military purposes. And SDI is really a part of this much broader transformation. The second myth is that SDI was this kind of just futuristic space laser program. In reality, SDI was an umbrella for multiple research and development efforts into advanced technologies with both missile defense applications and offensive counter space operations. And what that really means is being able to control the space domain for military purposes. And then I think the final thing that I would highlight is that SDI is often treated as something that just goes away when Reagan leaves the White House, goes away when the Cold War ends. But in reality, the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization, which managed the projects that fell under that umbrella, ultimately became the Missile Defense Agency that we have today. So from a technological standpoint, SDI is still with us, although in a reduced form. And when we look at the space security environment, a lot of the issues left unresolved in the 1980s between Washington and Moscow are still very much present in the international dialogue on space security.
So let's take a few of those in the course of this conversation. I think what we should do here is talk about the history of SDI first, and then we'll get into some contemporary lessons drawn. militarization of space. He said it's not a bolt from the blue. It doesn't just happen March 23rd, 1983. You suggest that there'd been kind of these creeping steps, these conversations about how space can be used for military advantage. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so space was, well, let me back up. In the 1980s, a lot of the hyperbole around SDI, especially people who were opponents of the program, was that SDI was militarizing space. In reality, space was militarized from the beginning of the space age in 1957. But for our purposes, what's important to recognize is that really from the early 1960s, space was critical for US and allied national security. Think functions like intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, communications, eventually navigation, weather monitoring, et cetera. But up until really the late 1970s, the United States was primarily focused on using space to host sensors that could support all these other functions that I just mentioned. But in the 1970s, a shift occurs when both the United States and the Soviet Union begin using space technologies, particularly intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance satellites, for tactical applications. So think enabling precision strikes against enemy forces deep behind enemy lines. So as a consequence of that, this shift that's taking place, in the final 48 hours of Gerald Ford's presidency, he initiates a new anti-satellite weapons program that would ultimately be tested in the Reagan presidency. But there was, at the time, a classified study that led to this new push for counter space capabilities to attack Soviet satellites. And it specifically said it is against the US national interest to treat space as a sanctuary. And if there is going to be a superpower conflict, it will extend into space because of the critical role that these space systems play. Now, there was no public debate on this. As I said, this was all highly classified within the US interagency, but it's a key part of the genealogy of SDI in this view that space is becoming more of a militarily competitive domain.
Yeah, and the intelligence community has a big role to play here. We hear about Team B intelligence exercises, and in the history of SDI, Team B is made out to be kind of a boogeyman for kind of false intelligence assessments. But you paint a different picture, that the intelligence community is a little more contested on their assessment of the Soviet threat than we've been led to believe.
Yeah, so what Anthony's referring to is Team B, which was also known as a competitive analytic project. Basically, a group of outside experts were brought in the Ford administration to look at all of these national intelligence estimates on Soviet military capabilities, and basically came to the conclusion that CIA had been consistently underestimating Soviet military power. Now, with the ending of the Cold War, looking back, a lot of those accusations made by Team B about the CIA were not correct. But what's important for our purposes is that when we fast forward to the Reagan administration, especially 1981 through 1983, a lot of the national intelligence estimates that were produced about Soviet investment in both missile defense and space programs were fairly ambivalent, but still painted a very negative picture. And so when Reagan is receiving these briefings, he's very concerned that there is potentially a gap emerging in these kinds of technologies in the Soviet favor. So there have been historians who have said that Reagan exaggerated the intelligence record. I think it's more accurate to say there were significant gaps in the intelligence reporting at the time, and Reagan tended towards some of the worst case scenario potentials. But it wasn't a situation in which the intelligence was very clear and the president was exaggerating what the intelligence community was saying.
So let's talk about who Reagan's engaging with on the issue of SDI, on ballistic missile defense. It's a good lesson for today, right? We're here at Aerospace Corporation, co-sponsored by the Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, groups that aren't directly in the executive branch or in the legislative branch, but still have some influence on national policy making today. And what comes very clear in your book is this kind of group of space enthusiasts, the laser lobby, all these outside groups that have impact. And what are those outside groups? How do they go about making impact on the space security issue?
Yeah, I think, again, one of the kind of at least misnomers about SDR, misunderstandings. It was something that came from outside the bureaucracy. The US bureaucracy in general, the Department of Defense, elements in the intelligence community were vehemently opposed to SDI. And so understanding where did this program come from, why did Reagan pursue it, it is important to understand the influence of certain interest groups. And so in the 1970s, there were a couple of figures that come on the scene, especially the mid to late 70s. One is Senator Malcolm Wallop. Another was Angelo Codevilla, who was a congressional staffer. And then Lieutenant General Daniel Graham, who had been the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And basically, these individuals and some of their colleagues come to the conclusion that not only are the Soviets investing in these kinds of technologies that we've been alluding to, but that the US has a distinct advantage in space technologies, and that if the US invests more in space technologies for missile defense, for precision tracking of adversary weapon systems, that the US can secure qualitative advantages over the quantitatively superior Soviet armed forces. And so these interest groups come together. Ultimately, there would be this citizen advocacy group called High Frontier that Graham was heavily involved in. And basically, they're advocates. They're advocates. They're advocating in favor of these advanced missile defense technologies in the late 70s and in the 80s. But the most important thing was getting the ear of Reagan, even before he actually comes into the White House for the first time as president. And Reagan really believes by the late 1970s that technologies have advanced to a stage where comprehensive missile defense would indeed be a possibility.
You know, we talk about SDI as a program that has a lot of elements to it. The space-based element, the kind of kinetic kill element. Shed a little light on those layers of technology that are involved and kind of the big umbrella picture of SDI. And then maybe we can get into which one of those systems has a life after the 80s and into today.
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that when Reagan makes his March 1983 speech that becomes known as the Star Wars speech, he doesn't actually mention anywhere in that speech space. He doesn't say the word laser. He just talks about American scientists developing a capability that would render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. It's fairly broad. And when the Strategic Defense Initiative is formally established about a year later in January of 84, there isn't any kind of specific plan in place for what kind of technologies are going to be pursued. There is discussion of more advanced futuristic technologies like directed energy weapons, lasers, et cetera. But what becomes pretty clear by the late 1980s is that if the US is going to pursue any kind of near-term missile defense, it's going to have to rely on kinetic kill interceptors, land and space-based. And why space-based? Because if you want to kill a missile in its boost phase of flight, then getting in space to do that is really important. And on top of the interceptors, you also need to have sensors in space and on the ground to be able to track these missiles in all phases of flight. Reagan isn't particularly wed to any specific technological concept, but what he does want to see is significant progress made by the end of his presidency towards a first phase system, which requires pushing these more futuristic technologies into the into a future administration and focusing on kinetic kill technologies in the near term.
Some important lessons for today are thinking about how this bureaucracy is organized and stood up. And we know very well today that perhaps some of the intrigue about SDI and the controversy that existed were because Cap Weinberger, Secretary of Defense, and George Shultz, Secretary of State, were largely kept out of the formation process in terms of announcing SDI. And afterwards, that kind of bureaucracy that arises is not under their control. Tell me a little bit about SDIO, what it means then, what it means today, what's the model that it's laid forth?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to stress that when Reagan makes that speech, he's in effect calling for the most radical transformation in American defense strategy in the Cold War, because he's talking about rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. And he made the decision to make that speech and to insert that language without consulting the interagency. So the Secretary of Defense didn't know. The Secretary of State found out really about 24 hours before the speech. And Reagan recognized that if it was put into the interagency for discussion, that it was going to be killed in the interagency. And so Reagan talked with his national security advisor and said, we're only going to have a very small number of people who know that I'm going to make this particular, and include these lines in the speech. The Joint Chiefs knew that he was interested in missile defense, didn't know that he was going to make the speech in March of 1983. So that's kind of the origin story for the speech. But the bureaucracy for SDI is interesting because once Reagan makes that speech, the Secretary of Defense does get on board with the project. And the Secretary of Defense knows that the Air Force, in particular, is going to oppose the program. And if I can make some negative remarks about my former military service, the Air Force was known to have a bit of a parochial attitude when it came to space technologies. So Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, said, we need to have a special bureaucratic structure. We need to have a strategic defense initiative organization that's going to run it all with a 3-star general in charge who's going to direct report to me. So in effect, the chain of command for SDI, research and development, is the president to the Secretary of Defense to the head of the program. Why? Because Weinberger was worried that if it was if SDIO was put under some existing acquisition organization, that the program would indeed be stifled. And Weinberger was correct. The Air Force in particular did not support the program. Air Force tried to undermine it on Capitol Hill, but this specialized acquisition structure was really one of the key things in sustaining SDI through the 80s and into the early 1990s.
Yeah, acquisition brings us into the question of allies and partners. And certainly we want to hear from you about SDI's impact on industry in the US, but also about SDI's impact on the national security or international security apparatus in Europe, specifically NATO, and their kind of own industry interests at a time where we are seeing a big kind of technological leap in the world economy along the lines of microelectronics and computing power and whatnot.
So when Reagan makes that speech in March of 1983, if no one in the interagency had been consulted, then no U.S. allies were consulted either. So when Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the UK is watching the speech, she in effect says, what is Reagan talking about when the West Germans hear it, the French, et cetera? There's a lot of concern about, is Reagan just being hyperbolic or is he actually sincere? And it takes the allies a little bit of time to figure out, no, the president is indeed very sincere, but there's a lot of concern. France and Britain are relatively small nuclear powers, and so they're worried that if there's going to be a missile defense buildup in the United States, maybe the Soviets are going to build up their missile defenses. Would that undermine the credibility of their nuclear deterrence? But then the piece that Anthony just alluded to is these greater concerns about a technology gap between the United States and Europe. And when the Europeans look at SDI, they see a project not only with significant defense implications, but also economic and industrial implications. So if SDI is going to involve advanced software, computing, information networks, sensors with both civilian and military applications, the European allies are faced with a situation in which many of them don't want to support Reagan's vision for SDI, but they want to get involved in the program to benefit technologically. And so ultimately, by the end of the Cold War, by 1990, 1991, multiple foreign countries in Europe, and then Japan and Israel would also become involved in the project. And if we look at Israel in particular, a lot of Israeli missile defense technologies came out of cooperation with the United States on SDI. But for all of these US allies, they're looking at it in both strategic military terms and also economic industrial.
I think you and I agree that Reagan's perhaps the biggest space enthusiast to hold the office of president, certainly one of the 3 biggest space enthusiasts to hold the office of president. We've talked about the industrial dynamics and the kind of implications for trade and economy with allies. But a big part of this is the commercial aspect and the way that the military developments and commercial developments in space under the Reagan administration go hand in hand. I know you have a lot to say about this. So what do you have to say about this?
So if we think about the commercial space economy today, a lot of the legislative foundation was laid in the 1980s. And certainly from an ideological standpoint, Reagan had this idea that the United States needed to expand its power in space across the board. So in July 1982, he made a speech at Edwards Air Force Base after the space shuttle conducted one of its early missions. And at Edwards, he talked about the importance of American space leadership. Excuse me. And Reagan had this very Mahanian idea that commercial space power and military space power were two sides of the same coin. And so Reagan believed that eventually there would be greater commercialization of space, but that the United States needed to have military space power to buttress that commercialization of space. The New York Times described Reagan as the biggest space enthusiast to have occupied the Oval Office. And Reagan really believed that demonstrating greatness in space was a key part of not only his foreign policy, but he saw himself as reinvigorating American investment in space technologies across the board. And so why it's important to recognize that is really SDI is one part of a much broader space agenda that Reagan had in mind. We also have to remember the precursor to the International Space Station was established in the Reagan administration. What would become the ISS was established by Reagan. So Reagan's space policy is much more expansive than just military power.
You know, what you've done is you've laid out really some interesting ways to think about how SDI fits in Reagan's strategy. Reagan's strategy on national security terms, Reagan's strategy for reinvigorating the American economy. And what you've pointed to is kind of a callback to the days of the Monroe Doctrine, right? Like make the seas safe for commerce, make space safe for commerce. How do you see SDI fitting in? Again, we've heard that maybe it didn't fit into a grand strategy. I think there's a big argument on that. But how do you see SDI fitting into kind of Reagan's worldview about the U.S. place in the world economy, about the U.S. place in international security, what have you?
Well, yeah, one of the challenges with fitting SDI into what Anthony's asking about is there were some contradictory elements to Reagan's messaging on SDI. So he saw it at times as a tool of competition with the Soviet Union, and he sincerely believed that. At one point, Reagan wrote in his diary, "The Soviets are working twice as hard as us to come up with superiority in space." But at the same time, Reagan believed that SDI could be a tool of peace. And he very sincerely talked publicly and with Mikhail Gorbachev directly about sharing SDI with the Soviet Union. And so I've had multiple people say to me in the course of writing this book that Reagan was not sincere when he said that, and I would say that's absolutely false. If you go to the Reagan library and look through the declassified documents, you can actually see Reagan directing members of his senior staff to come up with strategies for how could we share SDI technologies with the Soviet Union. And some of those efforts would actually be parlayed into sharing missile defense warning data with the Russians in the 1990s. But just stepping back for a moment, Reagan did see SDI technologies as having a competitive application, but also in other contexts, a cooperative application.
Do we look past the obvious sometimes on SDI, where it's both an instrument for peace, but it's an instrument for superiority? It sounds a lot like the peace through strength strategy that had been articulated pretty early on in the Reagan administration?
Well, I think there were layers within the Reagan administration, layers of views on, and a diverse set of views on how SDI could be used. So if we look at the Department of Defense and the Office of the Secretary of Defense, for example, this has all been declassified now. But at the time, publicly, the messaging on SDI is it would enhance deterrence. It would be a tool of peace. It would potentially lead to a situation in which there's less reliance on nuclear weapons. But at the same time, members of the Office of Secretary of Defense were talking about how SDI technologies could be used in an offensive space control role. So what does that mean? The same interceptors that could be used to shoot down ballistic missiles could also be used to shoot down Soviet satellites in a wartime situation. Now, that kind of reality, that kind of application, that offensive application was not something that the White House or the Department of Defense wanted to publicly highlight because it would have undermined the public presentation of SDI. But it shows that there were elements in the Department of Defense, elements in the White House who did indeed see the offensive applications of SDI as something that should be cultivated. But there were other officials in the Reagan administration, George Shultz, for example, the Secretary of State, who believed that SDI should be used as a bargaining chip in arms control negotiations. And so there wasn't really one coherent view of SDI within the White House. But what ultimately won out in many ways was Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense's views that the White House, that Reagan in particular, should not accept any constraints on SDI within the arms control negotiation.
Yeah, so let's get into those arms control negotiations. SDI becomes the linchpin, right? Gorbachev says we'll get rid of all nuclear weapons or missiles, depending on the document you read, if you just give up SDI at Reykjavik, right? There is a lot of difference in opinion on SDI's role in the Reagan administration's effort to win the Cold War. Where do you come down on kind of the place of SDI, the importance of SDI in those arms control negotiations at the great power summits at the end of the Cold War?
Yeah. So I think if we think about the history of arms control at the end of the Cold War, it's a triumphant one. We have INF and we have START. But what we need to remember is that those treaties grew out of something called the Nuclear and Space Talks. And there would be no new treaty limiting military activities in outer space, largely due to US and Soviet disagreement over space-based missile defense, SDI in particular. So, it's kind of a complicated story, but the more reductive version of it is that when Gorbachev comes into power, like Reagan, he wants to make serious progress in arms control, but there's a serious disagreement over whether missile defense can indeed be allowed. Deploying missile defenses would go beyond the 1972 ABM treaty. And so Reagan, in effect, says, look, eventually we're going to have to go beyond the ABM treaty. And the Soviets say, if you go beyond the ABM treaty, we can't have progress in nuclear arms reductions. So in 1987, Gorbachev unilaterally delinks SDI from progress on strategic nuclear forces, which paves the way for the INF treaty. And then ultimately an accommodation is reached in the Bush 41 administration with the Russians on strategic nuclear forces, leading to START. The issues, the disagreements surrounding SDI, though, are really left unresolved. So the Moscow basically says, as the Cold War is coming to an end, if you, the Americans, go beyond the ABM treaty, we'll just see what we're going to do at the time. We might back out of these arms control agreements that we've made, but there's no actual comprehensive agreements put in place on missile defense, on space, on the ABM treaty. So did SDI bully or coerce the Soviets into INF and START? No. Did the Soviets take the threat of SDI seriously? Yes. There were elements in the Soviet Ministry of Defense who were extremely concerned about what the implications of a deployed space-based missile defense would be for their own strategic nuclear forces. But Gorbachev was really motivated to sign those arms control agreements in large part due to the economic reforms that he had in mind, that to reform the Soviet economy, you have to restrain the arms race. And I think what's interesting is there was an alignment of views between Reagan and Gorbachev on nuclear weapons. They just had opposing views on how you actually get there. Reagan believed you couldn't have a world without nuclear weapons unless SDI was the insurance policy. Gorbachev said we can't get there unless we first have constraints on missile defense.
Yeah, and all that, it's interesting. Gorbachev first tries the public diplomacy test, right? I mean, he really does try to attack SDI as another spiral on the arms race to appeal to those Western European publics, those American publics that are seeking to constrain investment in ballistic missile defense. And I think the Reagan administration does a pretty good job of standing up to that kind of public diplomacy propaganda assault, which then leads to, I think, a more productive and kind of familiar exchange on arms control between the two. What you've done a good job, though, of leading us into this discussion before we can kind of get into some more contemporary lessons, the Soviets. Up until fairly recently, every story about SDI that we read in the English language pretty much was seen from the views of Washington, D.C. with speculation about Moscow, and Moscow was always painted as a monolith. But you've been able to kind of articulate different lines of thinking in Soviet policymaking. Where do you see the fault lines?
So there were certainly elements within the Soviet, basically their equivalent of military industrial complex, defense industrial base, who would have loved if the Soviet leadership had said, build a Soviet equivalent of SDI. And the Soviets were indeed doing work, research and development on certain equivalent technologies, just not on the scale envisioned and pushed by President Reagan. But I do think there's a tendency to treat the Soviet Union as a monolith. And even in the Gorbachev years, there were a range of views on what the implications of SDI would be for Soviet defense strategy. And I think that one of the pieces that we have to remember is that the Reagan administration is still figuring out, up until about 1987, 88, of what would a first phase strategic defense system look like. So in that same time period, the Soviets are trying to figure out what would a first phase strategic defense system look like and how would we counter it. So one of the things that Gorbachev tells Reagan is, if you guys deploy space-based defenses, we're not going to deploy our own, but we are going to invest in what he called asymmetric countermeasures. So more anti-satellite weapons, for example, to be able to shoot down elements of an SDI deployed architecture. But I think that what's important to emphasize is, just as there was no consensus within the Reagan White House on what an SDS system should look like, or whether it was even prudent to pursue this, there was no consensus within the Soviet bureaucracy about what the implications of SDI might be. But Gorbachev certainly wanted to forestall the deployment of any kind of SDI technologies.
So let's start moving our way up to the present day. And there's certainly all sorts of implications for arms control and nuclear conventional imbalance and whatnot. But before we get there, SDI looks a little different after Reagan. Looks a little different in the 1990s. Looks a little different in the days and months of leading up to 9/11 in the Bush II administration. Can you give us that quick readout before we can start thinking about the legacy for space security today?
So when Reagan leaves the White House, what SDIO was pushing was a concept for a first phase system based heavily on ground and space-based interceptors. And the space-based interceptor layer is known as brilliant pebbles, which you can see a depiction of that on the cover of my book. And when Bush 41 comes into office, the political situation is dramatically changing. The relationship with the Soviet Union is no longer as contentious, as adversarial. And members of Congress, even ones who had been moderately to generally supportive of SDI, said, well, why would we invest billions of dollars in space-based missile defense if we have these arms control agreements with the Soviet Union and then the Russian Federation, and the Soviet threat and the Russian threat is no longer quite as severe? So the SDI promoters said, well, maybe a more limited space-based defense, and it could protect against accidental nuclear launches or from nuclear proliferation risks, that if Muammar Gaddafi or Iran or North Korea develops nuclear weapons, then maybe we can have a more limited defense to protect ourselves. But a combination of factors. One, there is widespread concern that if the US deploys space-based defenses, that could undermine the arms control agreements. There's that political problem. Technologically, there were a couple of tests of brilliant pebbles, 3 to be precise, and they were failures for a number of reasons. And so that really undermined the SDIO cause with Congress. And then when Bill Clinton comes into office, President Clinton, in effect, says, we're not going to get rid of missile defense, but we're only going to focus on ground-based interceptors. And that was largely a political decision. And I've had a number of people say to me, this was a technological problem. And I would say it was a political problem first, and the technological complexities were certainly present in the discussion. But even if those, let's just say counterfactually, even if those brilliant pebbles tests had been successful, I can't prove it, of course, because it's counterfactual, but I strongly believe that President Clinton still would have said, we're going to focus on ground-based defenses for political reasons. So I'm not saying that there were no technological complexities. The technological issues were numerous, but it was the politics of the time, both domestically and in terms of international security, that drove the downgrading of missile defense to a focus on just ground-based interceptors and sensors in space to track and target.
Okay, so right now, we just had reports yesterday or this morning of the failed Satan II ICBM test in Russia. Clearly a kind of an attempt at some nuclear saber rattling, among other things. The Chinese nuclear arsenal is growing by leaps and bounds. Clearly there is a a more dangerous nuclear environment today than there has been at any point since the end of the Cold War. We don't have any good arms control agreements in place between between the Russians and the United States, and certainly between the Chinese. So is it time to start reinvesting heavily in a kind of space-based system or a missile defense system, or do we need to pursue kind of a Reaganite strategy of balancing arms control talks with investment in missile defense capabilities?
So in answering the question about investing in missile defenses, I can't really give a straightforward answer to that question because it really depends on your view of deterrence. And one of the views that was put forward in the late 80s was that you don't need to have a perfect missile defense system. You don't need to have the ability to take out 100% of Soviet ICBMs. But what you do need to do is introduce enough uncertainty into your adversary's calculus that having this kind of capability, having space-based missile defense, would have some kind of deterrent effect. I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. I'm saying that was one viewpoint. Another viewpoint was that if you deploy these missile defenses, the Soviets are just going to deploy more ICBMs. They're going to invest more in countermeasures. And so a lot of this really depends on your view of the military balance and what you think is going to have some kind of deterrent applications or deterrent effects. In terms of arms control, I think one of the great lessons from this period, especially in the space context, is that the entanglement of missile defense and anti-satellite weapons technologies is a really big problem in arms control negotiations. So why is that? The same technologies that you would use to kinetically attack a satellite, you can use to shoot down a ballistic missile. So Russia and China, for example, have been saying to the United States for years now that if you want to have progress in any kind of space security dialogue, then we need to talk about constraints on missile defense. And that entanglement piece creates a real issue in progress. It also creates an issue in even defining what is a space weapon. And an example of this, in 2008, the United States conducted an operation called Operation Burnt Frost, in which the US Navy used a modified SM-3 interceptor, sea-based interceptor, to shoot down a malfunctioning US government satellite. The Russians and Chinese have said SM-3 is a space weapon. US says it is a missile defense interceptor. It is not primarily intended for a counter space role. And so if you enter into an arms control negotiation and Russia and China say, we can only have progress if you will put constraints on missile defenses because they have counter space applications, that's going to be a real problem for the United States, especially because of the growing importance of theater missile defenses. So one of the challenges is a definitional one. And I think that if history is any guide, it was challenging enough in a bilateral context, US-Soviet Union, US-Russia. Now, really, to have any significant progress, any meaningful progress, it would have to be at minimum trilateral, US, Russia, China. But we also have to remember that in the post-Cold War era, there's been a proliferation of advanced missile defense technologies. India has demonstrated the ability to shoot down a satellite with a modified missile defense capability. And so the bipolar dynamic in this arena from the Cold War is no longer present. So it's a much more complex situation today.
Speaking of more complexity in today's environment and the number of actors in space, we're living in a new era where commercial actors, private actors are certainly have a larger presence in space. The commercial military connection today, are there lessons from the 80s to draw from that? I mean, certainly it's so crowded in low Earth orbit. I mean, are these considerations we have to take into effect more fully as we contemplate missile defense?
I mean, I think that the main connection that I can draw is that within the Strategic Defense Initiative organization, there was discussion of what we would today call proliferated constellations. And the idea being that we want more systems in orbit because that creates more targets for the adversary and means that it's going to be more difficult for your adversary to knock out these satellites that play a critical function, whether it's an intelligence function or a missile warning and tracking function. So from a kind of technological philosophy standpoint, that's one of the key connections that I would draw. But I think that the Reagan administration certainly did not foresee the market growth that would occur in the early 21st century in the commercial space market. It was certainly something that Reagan wanted to foster, but couldn't have anticipated just how large of an explosion of commercial space capabilities there would indeed be.
Well, speaking of foresight, we've talked a little bit about Space Force and the marketing, the rollout, kind of public diplomacy aspects of Space Force. I mean, is there a legacy from the 80s that kind of framed that Space Force rollout for us? Do you think it had some impact on how not just Americans, but people around the world thought about the seriousness of Space Force, its mission?
I mean, I can say this because I'm no longer in government. I think the rollout of the Space Force was frankly dreadful in terms of the public presentation. And I think that one of the things the Reagan administration did was came up with a concerted strategy. It was actually called the SDI Bible. And it was a concerted strategy for how are we going to present this to the public. I think one of the differences between SDI and Space Force is there were a lot of people in the United States and Europe, Soviet Union, who took it very seriously, whether they were for it or against it. But I think that what the SDI story shows is the importance of having a coherent public presentation of why this is important. Doesn't mean that you're going to get everyone on board. But that was really critical for just having some kind of unified message for why are we doing this? What is the point? I will say the Space Force has improved. And I think the current Chief of Space Operations, General Saltzman, has done a really good job of articulating why this service exists. But one of the challenges with space, whether it's the 1980s or today, is that the US has traditionally not talked a lot about national security activities in this domain. It's been highly classified. And so people have a perception, largely due to US government messaging going back to the Eisenhower administration, that space is for exploration, it's for peace. The military applications of space technologies have not really been a key part of US public diplomacy. And I think for better or for worse, people tend to lean on pop culture representation. So why is SDI known as Star Wars? Because Senator Ted Kennedy said derisively, this is Star Wars technology. And even today, people have visions of something like Star Trek going on when they hear about the Space Force. So one of the key lessons is it's important to have a straightforward, simple set of talking points that articulate to the average American taxpayer of what's at stake with these technologies, what's at stake with this domain, why it matters for US national security across the board, and why it matters for our allies. And fortunately, the war in Ukraine, well, the war in Ukraine is a terrible thing, but from a space standpoint, it's provided a really key example for the role of space technologies in modern warfare, and an unclassified example. You can talk about Starlink left, right, and center. But you need to have those simple, straightforward messaging points. Otherwise, people are going to lean on inappropriate analogies that are not really going to help the cause of the US government.
So that's the external, and let's talk about the internal, and then I want to hand it over to the audience for some questions. I know we have quite a few people online who have some thoughts on this. But the internal, SDIO kind of creates a new bureaucratic model that has a lasting impact on how the US government does business in space. I think for this group, it'd be good if you could lay out kind of that legacy.
Yeah, so the Space Development Agency was modeled directly on the Strategic Defense Initiative Organization. And there's a personal link there. Mike Griffin, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, was a key figure in SDIO. And he said, if the Space Development Agency is going to be successful, you need to have an acquisition structure that allows you to move quickly and not get bogged down in the red tape of existing bureaucracy. And so SDIO really provided an acquisition model and a technological philosophy for the Space Development Agency. So that's part one. And then part two is that Brilliant Pebbles, even though it never came into existence, was in many ways a part of the genealogy of the proliferated warfighter architecture that the DoD is pushing today, that we need to have large numbers of systems in orbit to be able to track missile threats in all phases of flight. So organizationally and technologically, there's a key linkage between SDI and what we see today, both within the space bureaucracy as well as the actual architecture that has been adopted.
All right, Aaron, enough with the softballs from me. Let's go to some hard-hitting questions from the audience. Caolionn, I believe you're going to cue us in on what's happening online, virtually, and certainly anyone in person. We'd like to hear from you as well. Caolionn, do you have anything for us?
I'll start with the debate on moving toward a sustained space maneuver architecture today seems to be another example of dual use technologies that could be used for defensive maneuvers, but also for offensive. What would be the lessons we should apply from the challenges SDI faced as both a tool for deterrence and aggression to the debate on sustained space maneuvers?
Well, we just hosted a debate on sustained space maneuver, the Space Policy Institute, and it became a lot more contentious than I had anticipated. But I think that the key thing I would draw out from that question is the dual use nature of these technologies. And a lot of technologies that are being contemplated for commercial civil applications have defense applications, whether actually defensive in nature or offensive. And so I think that one of the challenges is, from a U.S. standpoint, being able to discern how an adversary might use these dual-use technologies is one challenge. But then from an arms control or risk reduction standpoint, there's also significant complexities because of this increasingly blurry relationship between commercial space and national security space.
Hi, gentlemen. Fascinating discussion. David Trulio, President and CEO of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. So, Aaron, I'd love for you to zoom out a little bit and talk to us, if you would, about the role of presidential leadership in developing, marshaling, selling a major defense program. Obviously, we've been focusing today on SDI, but more broadly, how do you see that working? And then, if you can speak specifically to the interplay with Congress, because obviously Congress is a co-equal branch. How do you see that, and what are the implications for the president?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. It's a really important one because I think what the SDI story shows is the importance of presidential leadership. So even though I make the argument that SDI is a part of this broader transformation taking place, SDI would not have been established or sustained without Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan's commitment to SDI and his commitment to creating a structure that would allow SDI to gain momentum and be sustained. If we fast forward to the 21st century, whether you like the Space Force or not, I think it's another case of presidential leadership being a key role. The bureaucracy, the defense bureaucracy, as a general statement, was not supportive of the Space Force. The Secretary of Defense at the time, the Secretary of the Air Force at the time were not supportive of the Space Force. But in both instances, SDI and the Space Force, there was a constituency in Congress. And the congressional support is necessary because if we're talking about SDI, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar program. You can't sustain it unless you have some congressional support. And so the presidential leadership is one piece, but also Reagan picked a team of people who were able to really help on the congressional front. And one of the most important decisions he made was picking Lieutenant General Jim Abramson to run that program. Jim Abramson was the best SDI salesman the White House could have ever picked. He was charismatic, he was articulate, and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher even said, largely due to Jim Abramson, she became a supporter of SDI. It took some time, and that's a whole story in and of itself. But the president was able to put together what was in effect a team that was able to effectively deal with some of the detractors in Congress. And I think that those lessons persist even through to the present time. Often we think about the bureaucratic forces at play, but that presidential leadership was really critical, especially for sustaining SDI into the 1990s.
We also have a question. Surprised to hear that Reagan sought ways to transfer SDI technology to the Soviets. I presume, maybe wrongly, that most SDI technologies were highly classified. Can you elaborate on what types of technologies he was intending to transfer?
Yeah, so this posed a real problem in the interagency when Reagan said to his national security advisor, come up with a strategy for doing this for the reasons that were stated. And the response was, well, we don't even share a lot of these technologies with our closest allies. How are we ever going to do this with the Soviets? So one of the ideas that was floated was that we could have a range of options. I'll just highlight a couple. We could have some kind of joint operations center where you have Soviet personnel who can see data coming in on, missile warning threats, for example, that you could potentially share some kind of missile defense technologies, not necessarily sensors for tracking and targeting missiles, but even eventually have some kind of joint control over certain interceptors. I mean, there's a whole range of potential things that were floated. And in general, the U.S. interagency was vehemently opposed to any kind of technology transfer. And I think it's unlikely that the U.S. Congress would have probably supported that. But ultimately, what was adopted was data sharing. That was seen as the most likely path that could be taken, short of actually transferring any missile defense technologies because of the national security risks. And in the Bush 41 administration, sharing missile defense early warning data was in effect what was adopted. But even that was contentious. Key U.S. allies in Europe were vehemently opposed with any kind of missile defense cooperation with the Russian Federation.
Aaron, you were talking about, the parochial nature of the Air Force and asking what was going on with the FBI in the 80s. I'm curious how either of you, both of you, assess the, establishment of the Space Force and how that has helped to allow the SDA and others to thrive in a way that the SDI might not have in the 80s. And also, how do you assess the interagency partnerships going on this time around? Missile defense, Space Systems Command, SDA, where might those be improved? What is going well?
And for that second question, are you talking about for the contemporary context? Yeah, okay. So for Space Force, I have a lot of opinions on Space Force, but what I'll say is that the Space Force has not, of course, fixed all of the problems in the U.S. national security space community. We still have a lot of organizations with their hands in the space pot. And you have the Title 10, Title 50 issues. You have the intelligence community with its equities, and then you have several Department of Defense equities. So Space Force is just one organization of many. I think the most positive thing to have come from the Space Force is it has highlighted at a national level the importance of military space operations, national security space operations writ large. And I don't know if it would have been possible to highlight it on the scale that it is now without the stand-up of a service. That doesn't mean that it was a prudent decision, but that's just the reality as I see it. I'm heavily involved in academic security studies communities. And I would say 5 years ago, if you went to a security studies conference and said, hey, what do people think about space security? People would give you, the deer in the headlights, like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But today, just the fact that you have more academic security studies experts looking at this topic, I think is a result in part of this greater attention on this domain. In terms of lessons, I don't really have just, a couple of short lessons. What I would say is that there's significant continuity between the 80s and today on disagreements among these various agencies and different equities. So for example, in the 1980s, the NRO basically said, look, we live in the black world and we're not too comfortable with all this attention being placed on space publicly, and that could undermine some of our equities. There were also elements in the intelligence community who said, yeah, we don't think it's such a great idea to be promoting the development of offensive space capabilities because our main focus is on having systems in space to conduct reconnaissance operations unimpeded. And so there's a bit of a cultural or philosophical difference there on what kinds of systems should even be acquired. So today, I think that you still have this problem and that you have numerous different equities across the intelligence community and the DoD, and aligning those two is no simple task or easy feat, even from a resource allocation perspective.
We also had another question on lessons learned regarding negotiating international space partnerships from SDI and navigating our allies and bringing them into the fold. And I think a lot of those same contemporary issues are going on now.
Yeah, so I think one of the big challenges with the allies on the political front was in the 80s, educating them on what does this mean for transatlantic security? What does this mean for NATO? Because again, space certainly in the late Cold War was more secretive than even nuclear policy and strategy. NATO actually had consultative mechanisms for nuclear strategy, nuclear weapons employment. There was no consultative mechanism for space. And so within the alliance, how do you even discuss these issues? Because remember, not everyone in the alliance is a member of the Five Eyes. And so there's significant security classification issues for even having an open dialogue. When it comes to allied engagement, one of the key problems in the 80s was just export controls. So you would have allies say, we want to become involved. And the answer is, we'd love for you to be involved, but there's going to be significant red tape to even being able to transfer some of this technology. And so if we think about AUKUS, for example, with Pillar 2, space is one of the areas. And while there have been advances made in export control regulation, it's great. You can have political support all day long from the heads of government, United States, and name your ally country. But if you don't have the export control procedures in place, then that can lead to political problems down the road. That the ally says, look, I've come out and said, I want to be a part of this. I want to cooperate. I want to have joint projects and whatever the program might be. But if you can't get that export control framework squared away, that can create real tensions in the relationship with the allies.
All right, well, I think that's been a good run of questions for you, Aaron. Certainly, hopefully everyone stays tuned on what you're working on. I know you had a new article out today. So please continue to pay attention to Aaron's work on SDI and space security today, and join me in thanking him for this wonderful fireside chat.
Thank you.